In the previous video, we did some comparative statics on consumer theory, and we discussed the income effect. And the question we asked is the following: what happens to consumption of a good when only real income changes and price ratio stays the same? And we have answered this, and we know what is income effect, and we have distinguished between and also showed what happens when we have a normal good, what happens when we have an inferior good. The next thing we do in terms of comparative statics is we ask the following question: what happens to consumption of a good when real income stays the same and price ratio changes? Look at the difference between this and this question. In the first one, real income changes, price ratio stays the same. In this question, what we are trying to understand is when real income stays the same and price ratio changes. This question can be answered by looking at the following diagram. We have that original line, budget line BL1. And now what I have done is I have drawn another budget line, let's call it BL4, and the characteristic of this budget line 4 is the following. It has a different slope relative to BL1, and what you find is BL4 is flatter than BL1, or in other words, PA by PO or the slope of the budget line is lower for BL4 relative to BL1, or in other words, relatively speaking, apples are cheaper relative to oranges in BL4 relative to BL1. Another thing you'll notice is this BL4 is tangent to the same indifference curve as BL1, so both of them are tangent to the same indifference curve, but they have different price ratios. Now when two or more budget lines are tangent to a given indifference curve, what this means is both these budget lines are giving the same level of satisfaction to this person, and so we can say or make or infer that BL4 and BL1 imply same real income. And why is this? Because both these budget lines give the same level of satisfaction to this consumer. So let us compare the equilibrium outcome under BL1, which is E1, with E4, which is the consumer equilibrium when we have budget line 4. And we know how many apples would this person consume when this person has BL1, and how many oranges would he consume when the budget constraint is set by BL1. And the same question we ask of BL4, and we know how many apples would this person consume when this person is constrained by BL4, and how many oranges would this person have. And what you find is the following. Now because BL4 means that apples have become relatively cheaper, what has happened to consumption of apples? It has increased. Now when apples have become relatively cheaper, oranges must have become relatively more expensive. Why orange is the other good, and what you find is a decline in consumption of oranges. So when you compare these types of equilibrium points where we have same real income but different price ratio, one thing you must remember is the following. Whichever commodity becomes or good becomes relatively cheaper, we are going to buy more of it, and whatever becomes relatively more expensive, we are going to buy less of it. And this is called the substitution effect. So what is the substitution effect on apples? And I'll just write this down. Substitution effect on apples is equal to A1, A4, A1, A4. And what is the substitution effect on oranges? You can identify that, and that will be O1, O4. I'll just write O1, O4. And that will be substitution effect on oranges. So here you have it, and let me just move this so you can read it clearly, and that's what we find. So this is an example of substitution effect. So two things that we have learned from the previous slide is, number one, when two or more budget lines are tangent to the same indifference curve, they exhibit same real income. This is another definition of same real income. What is the first one? You'll remember it when we discussed budget line, and that is given by the area of the triangle implied by a budget line. If two budget lines have the same area of triangle, they imply same real income. And here we have used another definition of same real income, and this is due to a British economist by the last name Hicks, and that is, two or more budget lines, when they are tangent to the same indifference curve, they imply same real income. Another thing we have looked at in the previous slide is the substitution effect, and here's a definition of substitution effect on apples, which is the change in consumption of apples when price ratio changes and the new budget line implies the same real income as the previous one, or is tangent to the original indifference curve. Substitution effect. And the last thing, again very important, is always remember, when we are looking at substitution effect, what we have is an unambiguous result. That is, whatever good becomes relatively cheaper, we are going to buy more of it. Now let us examine another question. In the first case, we kept price ratio the same and real income change. In the second case, what we did is we changed the price ratio but kept real income same. Now the next question for us to ask is, what happens to consumption of a good when both real income and price ratio change? And let us just examine this. Now consider the following configuration. About BL1 you already know. Income of this person is $5. Price of an apple is $1. Price of an orange is $1. And now we have a budget line where we keep the same nominal income, $5. We keep same price of orange, which is $1 per piece, but we reduce the price of an apple. Now this is something you'll remember when we discussed budget lines and we compared them. When we compare BL3 to BL1, what we find is the following. BL3 implies higher real income relative to BL1. So if everything else stays the same and price of one good falls, you'll have more purchasing power, or you have higher real income. Another thing implied by when we compare BL3 to BL1 is that BL3 implies lower PA by PO relative to BL1, or in other words, apples have become relatively less expensive relative to what? Oranges. So we'll make this comparison and show what is the effect on consumption. Now based on the information we had about BL3 and BL1, we have drawn these budget lines and we have corresponding indifference curves, and we know about equilibrium E1, point of tangency between IC1 and BL1, and we have this new budget line BL3, and you already know how BL3 compares to BL1. BL3 implies higher real income. Why? Because you can see clearly that the area of the triangle implied by BL3 is greater than area of the triangle implied by BL1. And since BL3 is flatter than BL1, that means BL3 implies lower PA by PO, or in other words, apples have become relatively less expensive. And so when this happens, what is the impact on consumption of apples? You see A1, A3, and here you see an increase in consumption of apples. What has happened to consumption of oranges? It has fallen. And what is it? It is O1, O3, O1, O3. Now this effect on change in consumption of apples or oranges, due to this phenomena, and that is when we have a situation like BL3 relative to BL1, this is called the price effect. And what is the price effect on apples? I'll just write PE on apples will equal A1, A3. And what is the price effect on oranges? Let me just type this out, and that will be O1, O3. And here you have it, and let me just rearrange this part, bring it here so you can read it. Here we go. So this is a case of price effect, and you can see this in terms of this. Here is the definition of price effect. And what is price effect? It is the change in consumption of a good when price of one good changes and nominal income and price of the other good stay the same. And you know what it does? It changes the real income as well as the price ratio. So we know about price effect. Now in the previous slide you had equilibrium points like E1, E3 simply because we are trying to measure the price effect. If we join those equilibrium points E1, E3, what we are going to get is a price consumption curve. And what is a price consumption curve? It is a collection of equilibrium points when price of one good changes and the values of all other variables stay the same, namely nominal income and prices of other goods. Now in these two videos, this one and the previous one, what we have looked at are three examples of comparative statics. And the question we have asked is basically what happens to consumption of a good, for example apples, when real income changes and price ratio stays the same, and we measured this through income effect. Another question we answered is what happens to consumption of a good when price ratio changes and real income stays the same, and this is called the substitution effect. And the third case we examined is when both real income and price ratio change. What effect do we have? It's called the price effect.